Today, we will be reading Inkheart by Cornelia Funk. Soon, the screen will go black. This is to make sure you can get a full night's rest without being distracted by any moving pictures. Chapter 1. A Stranger in the Night. Rain fell that night, a fine whispering rain. Many years later, Maggie had only to close her eyes, and she could still hear it, like tiny fingers tapping on the window pane. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, and however often she tossed and turned, Maggie couldn't get to sleep. The book she had been reading was under her pillow, pressing its cover against her ear as if to lure her back into its printing pages. I'm sure it must be very comfortable sleeping with a hard rectangular thing like that under your head, her father had teased the first time he found a book under her pillow. Go on, admit it. The book whispers its story to you at night. Sometimes, yes, Maggie had said, but it only works for children. Which made Mo tweak her nose. Mo. Maggie had never called her father anything else. That night, when so much began and so many things changed forever, Maggie had one of her favourite books under her pillow, and since the rain wouldn't let her sleep, she sat up, rubbed the drowsiness from her eyes, and took it out. Its pages rustled promisingly when she opened it. Maggie thought this first whisper sounded a little different from one book to another, depending on whether or not she already knew the story it was going to tell her. But she needed light. She had a box of matches hidden in the drawer of her bedside table. Mo had forbidden her to light candles at night. He didn't like fire. Fire devours books, he always said. But she was 12 years old. She could surely be trusted to keep an eye on a couple of candle flames. Maggie loves to read by candlelight. She has 5 candlesticks on the windowsill. She was just holding the lighted match to one of the black twigs when she heard the footsteps outside. She blew out the match in alarm. Oh, how well she remembered it, even many years later, and knelt to look out the window, which was wet with rain. And then she saw him. The rain cast a kind of pallor on the darkness, and the stranger was a little more than a shadow. Only his face gleamed as white as he looked up at Maggie. His hair clung to his wet forehead. The rain was falling on him, but he ignored it. He stood there, motionless, arms crossed over his chest, as if that might at least warm him a little. And he kept on staring at the house. I must go and wake Mo, thought Maggie. But she stayed put, her heart thudding, and went on gazing into the night, as if the stranger's stillness had infected her. Suddenly he turned his head, and Maggie felt as if he were looking straight into her eyes. She shot off the bed so fast the open book fell onto the floor, and she ran barefoot out into the dark corridor. This was the end of May, but it was chilly in the old house. There was still a light on in Mo's room. He often stayed up reading late into the night. Maggie had inherited her love of books from her father. When she took refuge from a bad dream with him, nothing could lull her to sleep better than Mo's calm breathing beside her and the sound of the pages turning. Nothing nothing, chased the nightmares away faster than the rustle of printed paper. But the figure outside the house was no dream. The book Mo was reading that night was bound in pale blue linen. Later, Maggie remembered that too. What unimportant little details stick in the memory. Mo, there's someone out in the yard. Her father raised his head and looked at her with the usual absent expression he wore when interrupted his reading. It always took him a few moments to find his way out of that other world, the labyrinth of printed letters. Someone out in the yard? Are you sure? Yes, he's staring at our house. Mo put down our book. So what were you reading before you went to go to sleep? Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? Maggie frowned. Please, Mo, come and look. He didn't believe her, but he went anyway. Maggie tugged him along the corridor so impatiently that he stubbed his toe on a pile of books, which was hardly surprising. Stacks of books were piled high, all over the house, not just arranged in neat rows on bookshelves, the way other people kept them. Oh no, the books in Mo's and Maggie's house were stacked under tables, on chairs, in the corners of the rooms. There were books in the kitchen and books in the lavatory, books on the TV set and in the wardrobe. Small piles of books, tall piles of books, books thick and thin, books old and new. They welcomed Maggie down to breakfast with invitingly opened pages. They kept boredom at bay when the weather was bad, and sometimes you fell over them. He's just standing there, whispered Maggie, leading Mo into her room. Has he got a hairy face? If so, he could be a werewolf. Oh, do stop it. Maggie looked at him sternly, although his jokes made her feel less scared. Already she hardly believed any more in the figure standing in the rain, until she knelt down again at the window. There! Do you see him? She whispered. Mo looked out through the raindrops running down the pane and said nothing. Didn't you promise burglars would never sneak into our house? Because there's nothing here to steal, whispered Maggie. He's not a burglar, replied Mo. But as he stepped back from the window, his face was so grave that Maggie's heart thudded faster than ever. Go back to bed, Maggie, he said. This visitor has come to see me. He left the room before Maggie could ask what kind of visitor. For goodness sake, who would turn up in the middle of the night? She followed him anxiously. As she crept down the corridor, she heard her father taking the chain off the front door, and when she reached the hall, she saw him standing in the open doorway. The night came in, dark and damp, and the rushing of the rain sounded loud and threatening. Dustfinger, called Mo into the darkness. Is that you? Dustfinger. What kind of name was that? Maggie couldn't remember ever hearing it before, yet it somehow sounded familiar, like a distant memory that wouldn't take shape properly. At first all seemed still outside, except for the rain falling, murmuring as if the night had found its voice. But then the footsteps approached the house, and the man emerged from the darkness of the yard, his long coat so wet with rain that it clung to his legs. For a split second, as the stranger stepped into the light spilling out of the house, Maggie thought she saw a small furry head over his shoulder, snuffling as it looked out of his rucksack and then quickly disappearing back into it. Dustfinger wiped his wet face with his sleeve and offered Mo his hand. "How are you, Silvertongue?" he asked. "It's been a long time." Hesitantly, Mo took the outstretched hand. "A very long time," he said, looking past his visitor as if he expected to see another figure emerge from the night. "Come in. You'll catch your death. Maggie says you've been standing out there for some time." "Maggie?" "Oh, of course." Dustfinger let Mo lead him into the house. He scrutinized Maggie so thoroughly that she felt quite embarrassed and didn't know where to look. In the end, she just stared back. "She's grown. You remember her?" "Of course." Maggie noticed that Mo double-locked the door. "How old is she now?" Dustfinger smiled at her. It was a strange smile. Maggie couldn't decide whether it was mocking, supercilious, or just awkward. She didn't smile back. 12, said Mo. 12? My word. Dustfinger pushed his dripping hair back from his forehead. It reached almost to his shoulders. Maggie wondered what colour it was when it was dry. The stubble around his narrow-lipped mouth was gingery, like the fur of the stray cat Maggie sometimes fed with a saucer of milk outside the door. Ginger hair had sprouted on its cheeks too, sparse as a boy's first beard, but not long enough to hide 3 long pale scars. They made Dustfinger's face look as if it had been smashed in and stuck back together again. 12, he repeated. Of course she was. Well, let's see. She was 3 then, wasn't she? Mo nodded. Come on, I'll find you some dry clothes. Impatiently, as if he was suddenly in a hurry to hide the man from Maggie, he led his visitor across the hall. And Maggie, he said over his shoulder, you go back to sleep. Then without another word, he closed his workshop door. Maggie stood there, rubbing her cold feet together. Go back to sleep. Sometimes when they stayed up late again, yet again, yet again, Mo would toss her down on the bed like a bag of walnuts. Sometimes he chased her around the house after supper until she escaped into her room, yet breathless with laughter. And sometimes he was so tired he lay down on the sofa, and she made him a cup of coffee before she went to bed. But he had never, ever sent her off to her room so brusquely. A foreboding, clammy and fearful came into her heart, as if along with the visitor whose name was so strange, yet somehow familiar, some menace had slipped into her life, and she wished so hard it frightened her that she had never fetched Mo, and Dustfinger had stayed outside until the rain washed him away. When the door of the workshop opened again, she jumped. Still there, I see, said Mo. Go back to bed, Maggie, please. He had that little frown over his nose that appeared only when something was really worrying him, and he seemed to look straight through her as if his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. The foreboding in Maggie's heart grew, spreading black wings. Send him away, Mo, she said as he gently propelled her towards her room. Please, send him away. I don't like him. Mo leaned in her open doorway. He'll be gone when you get up in the morning. Word of honour. Word of honour? No crossed fingers. Maggie looked at him straight in the eye. She could always tell when Mo was lying, however hard he tried to hide it from her. No crossed fingers, he said, holding both hands out to show her. Then he closed her door, even though she knew she didn't like it. Maggie put her ear to it, listening. She could hear the clink of china. So the man with the sandy beard was getting a nice cup of tea to warm him up. I hope he catches pneumonia, thought Maggie, though he needn't necessarily die of it. Maggie heard the kettle whistling in the kitchen, and Mo carrying a tray of clattering crockery behind him back to the workshop. When that door closed, she forced herself to wait a few more seconds, just to be on the safe side. Then she crept out into the passage. There was a notice hanging on the door of Mo's workshop, a small metal plaque. Maggie knew the words on it by heart. When she was 5, she often practiced reading the old-fashioned spindly lettering. Some books should be tasted, some devoured, but only a few should be chewed and digested thoroughly. Back then, when she still had to climb on a box to read the plaque, she had thought that chewing and digesting meant literally, and wondered horrified why Mo had hung this on his workshop door, the words of someone who vandalized books. Now she knew what the plaque really meant. But tonight, now, she knew she wasn't interested in written words. Spoken words were often what she wanted to hear, the words being exchanged in a soft, almost inaudible whispers by the two men on the other side of the door. Don't underestimate him, she heard Dustfinger say. His voice was so different from Mo's. No one else in the world had a voice like her father's. Mo could paint the pictures in the empty air with his voice alone. He'd do anything to get hold of it. That was Dustfinger again. And when I say anything, I can assure you, I mean anything. I'll never let him have it. That was Mo. He'll still get his hands on it, one way or another. I'll tell you. They're on your trail. It wouldn't be the first time. I've always managed to shake them off before. Oh, yes? And for how much longer, do you think? What about your daughter? Are you telling me she actually likes moving around the whole time? Believe me, I know what I'm talking about. It was so quiet behind the door that Maggie scarcely dared to breathe in the case that the two men heard her. Finally, her father spoke again. Hesitantly, as if his tongue found it difficult to form the words. Then what do you think I ought to do? Come with me. I'll take you to them. A cup clinked, the sound of a spoon against china. How loud small noises sound in a silence. You know how much Capricorn thinks of your talents. You'll be glad if you took it to him, out of your own free will. I'm sure he would. The man he found to replace you is utterly useless. Capricorn. Another peculiar name. Dustfinger had uttered it as if the mere sound might scorch his tongue. Maggie wriggled her chilly toes and wrinkled her cold nose. She didn't understand much of what the two men were saying, but she tried to memorize every single word of it. It was quiet again, in the workshop. Oh, I don't know. said the Mo at last. He sounded so weary that it tore at Maggie's heart. I'll have to think about it. When do you think this man will get here? Soon, Silvertongue. Soon. The word dropped like a stone in the silence. Soon, repeated Mo. Very well. I'll have made my mind up by tomorrow. Do you need a place? Replied Dustfinger. Oh, it's fine. I can always find a place, replied Dustfinger. I'm managing quite well these days, although it's still all too much fast for me. His laugh was not a happy one. But I'd like to know what you decide. May I come back tomorrow? About midday. Yes, of course. I'll be picking Maggie up from school at 1:30. Come after that. Maggie heard a chair being pushed back and scurried back into her room. When the door of the workshop opened, she was just closing her bedroom door behind her, pulling the covers up to her chin. She lay there, listening as her father said goodbye. And thank you for the warning anyway. She heard him as Dustfinger's footsteps moved away slowly and uncertainly, as if he hadn't said everything he wanted to say, but at last he was gone, and only the rain kept drumming its wet fingers on Maggie's window. When Mo opened the door of her room, she quickly closed her eyes and tried to breathe as slowly as you do in a deep, innocent sleep. But Mo wasn't stupid. In fact, he was sometimes terribly clever. Maggie, put one of your feet out of bed, he told her. Reluctantly, she stuck her toes out from under the blanket and laid them into Mo's warm hand. They were still cold. I knew it, he said. You've been spying. Can't you do just as I tell you for once? Sighing, he tucked her foot back underneath the nice warm blankets. Then he sat down on her underneath the nice bed. He passed his hands over his tired face and looked out of the window. His hair was as dark as moleskin. Maggie had fair hair like her mother, who she knew only from a few faded photographs. You should be glad you look like her more than me, Mo always said. My head wouldn't look at all good on a girl's neck. But Maggie wished she did look more like him. There wasn't a face in the world more that she loved. I didn't hear what you were saying anyway, she murmured. Good, Mo stared out of the window as if Dustfinger was standing in the yard. Then he rose and went to the door. Try to get some sleep, he said. But Maggie didn't want to sleep. Dustfinger. What sort of a name is that? She asked. And why does he call you Silvertongue? Mo did not reply. And this person who's looking for you, I heard what Dustfinger called him. Capricorn, who is he? No one you'd want to meet. Her father didn't turn around. I thought you didn't hear anything. Good night, Maggie. This time he left the door open. The light from the passage fell on her bed, mingling with the darkness of the night that seeped in through the window, and Maggie lay there waiting for the dark to disappear and take her fear of some evil menace away with it. Only later did she understand that the evil had not appeared for the first time that night. It had just slunk back in again.